Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Karen Rigby, author of Fabulosa. Before I introduce you to Karen, I'd like to invite you to become a member of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So, again, today I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce you to Karen Rigby. Born in the Republic of Panama in 1979, Karen Rigby now lives and writes in Arizona. Her latest poetry book, Fabulosa, is out from Jackleg Press, and that came out just a couple months ago. Her debut poetry book, Chinoiserie, was published by Asada Press in 2012, and that was selected by Paul Hoover for a 2011 Sawtooth Poetry Prize. Karen's work has been honored by a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, a Vermont Studio Center Fellowship, an Artist Opportunity Grant from the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. She is a 2023 recipient of an Artist Opportunity Grant from the Arizona Commission on the Arts. And her poetry is published in many journals, including the London Magazine, Poetry Northwest, the Oxonian Review, and Australian Book Review. So Karen, welcome to Poet to Poet.
Thank you, Radha, for joining me and all of you who are watching.
So Karen, I'd love to start with a question about this book's obsession with film. The poems in Fabulosa borrow quite a bit from film. And in a sense, I can see how poetry is a bit like film. It's a series of images sequenced so as to affect the audience. What is it about film that captivates you?
Well, to give you a little background, a long time ago, I watched Sunset Boulevard, which features Gloria Swanson playing Norma Desmond. And I actually mentioned Gloria in the book once. And it's a very subtle connection, but I was always drawn to that idea of performance. It's kind of a satire. There's this very eerie and moody villainry. And at the same time, it's kind of over the top and fun, too. So when I was approaching this book, I tried to keep that background mood in mind in terms of having a bit of glamour, a bit of darkness around the edges, and yet at the same time being a bit playful about it, being very knowing and aware and reaching to an audience with it so that it wouldn't be entirely serious, but it would still have that kind of balance between darkness and light. So that's one aspect. And as you mentioned, poetry uses a lot of imagery, which I tend to do in my own work as well. So I see that connection between film and poetry as not necessarily having this really hard boundary. They kind of do blur together. And I've kind of been playing with that with some of my recent work as well.
Wonderful. I love hearing about, where a work gets started, and it's often not clear to us as poets until we've put together a collection, right? So while we're in the thick of it, sometimes we're not aware that something's generating around sort of an origin point. But would you mind sharing a little bit about the process of developing the poems for this book? Where did they start?
So a little bit of background. My first book was mainly a revision of an MFA thesis. So in a certain sense, those were poems written in a very specific workshop kind of context, even though it wasn't published until years after I had graduated, but it had that kind of intensity time-wise. It had that kind of urgency and I would say attention to how to make a book because I had never made a book prior to that. So I read a lot of other poets' collections, and in a certain sense, I was trying to find my own footing with that. So that was the first book. But the second book came along much later. By that point, I had gotten married, I had two kids, I was no longer in graduate school, a lot of time had passed. So I was confronted with having to deal with a certain silence and how to be comfortable with the idea of maybe not writing at all for years. So the process for developing this book after that long silence was much more deliberate. in a way, I wasn't working with a set of drafts that had been a thesis. I was starting from scratch, basically. So how do you do that? How do you begin from what feels like nothing? So what happened was that I have an exchange with another poet who's fine, and we tend to trade early drafts. They're not revised, just early spontaneous work, almost on a weekly basis, without any critique. So there's no feedback in that sense. It's just having a sense that someone out there is waiting for you. So that helps to start getting the writing process going. And in the course of that, I wrote a poem called Why My Poems Arrive Wearing Black Gloves. And that poem became a blueprint for the rest of the book. So here I had one poem to begin with. Now, how do I make the rest of the book happen? What I did was I took several phrases from that first, which would become the section titles in the book. There's a total of 3 of them. And then I would keep returning to that poem periodically, just to capture some of the same mood, maybe to carry some of the same themes across the work. Like the poem mentions gloves. So I would deliberately search for paintings that had gloves in them so as to be able to start filling out the rest of the book. And I would look for small connections within that. For example, that poem has a little phrase about the plot. There's never a plot unless someone goes missing. And then at the very end of the book, towards the end, there's a poem called On the Failures of Plot. So in that sense, I was using that poem to continue teasing out as much as I possibly could out of it so as to make the book happen.
What a fantastic example of how we can, not only be looking outward for our inspiration, but also paying attention to the things that are emerging right there in front of you. Sort of a more internal sense of that work arising. So I'd love to maybe have you read that poem that sparked the book, and that is in fact the opening poem. Yes.
Yes, sure. Yeah. Why my poems arrive wearing black gloves, like twin gauntlets set on the margin. Enter the female assassin, the screwball debutante, noir and glitz mixed in one bad throwback to an age when dahlias hold anyone who breathed them. My poems arrive wearing satin or suede to haunt you when they leave no trace. I've watched a man pull off his gloves with his teeth. The trick to undoing the wolf behind the saint is to make a slow-mo invitation of it. Because there's never a plot unless one of us goes missing. That's me at the aerodrome and you boarding a custard plane. Now fly a desultory wind before you vanish. That's the tension we need. I love an overblown image, a drawer full of hands wave in a solemn motorcade. My gloves pantomime moods so thick you could ladle gravy. About my first book, a critic wrote, I'm a little bored with the aesthetic. If that isn't damning, what is? My poems wear black to turn the dials and bag the ice. In the director's cut, I'm driving the hairpin curve when the camera rolls back to show you, looking louche but alive. You were always in on it. A poem is a diamond heist. Tell the critic no one watches a woman enter a room to look at her hands, just like no one's reading this poem to picture my life. But a black glove healed down the avenue of my arm. What wouldn't you do?
Thank you. Um, so I think this is a great setup for the next question I have, which is the book has 3 sections that are titled. The first is noir and glitz. The second is Wolf Behind the Saint, and then finally in the director's cut. So how did you come to have those section titles and to organize the book under those 3 uh, headings?
So when I went back to that opening poem, those were the 3 phrases that jumped out at me as possibilities. because a lot of my work does tend to play with darkness and light. So I naturally gravitated towards that noir and glitz. And for that first section of the book, that gave me a direction in terms of thinking what else might fit under that kind of rubric. And that in turn led me into writing certain poems about fashion, like Dior's bar suit or an Oscar dress. And what would I consider to be noir? That led me into thinking about certain crime dramas that I happened to be watching at the time. So it was a very deliberate kind of writing poems to suit that. This time around, instead of having poems to choose from to make a book, I was writing the poems specifically for the book. And the second title, Wolf Behind the Saint, that kind of gave me permission to go into maybe more autobiographical material, maybe a little bit more darkness in terms of teenage depression or adolescence. And by the time I got to the third section in the director's cut, at that point I was straining a little bit. It was during the pandemic. I kind of had the sense that this is starting to form an actual book and I can see the finish line is near. I'm not sure at all how to get there. So in that section, I loosened up a bit and I allowed it to be more like the outtakes that you would see in the director's cut. So there you might have a poem that brings in parenthood, which hadn't come in before, or a poem about mother-daughter relationships, or things that didn't specifically fit with the rest, but that I could still kind of justify as being part of me.
Mhm. Mhm. That's beautiful. And it's really a lovely progression too as a reader. And getting to that in the director's cut feels like, the way we might get really excited about seeing the outtakes or seeing those scenes that didn't make it into the mainstream, but very much feel like they have the directors, the cinematographers' fingerprints on them, and that they are sort of in the background of what is put forward in that main film. So I love that notion, and I love that you said permission. I love that you found permission to take that approach. I'm always encouraging my students to find where they can, in some other genre or in poetry itself, find those examples and those ways of working with the material that offer that kind of permission. So that's really beautiful. Maybe we could hear another poem. Would you like to read maybe Not the Ghost of the Rose?
Yes, let me pull that up here. So a little background, as Radha mentioned, I was born in Panama, which is where setting for this. Not the ghost of a rose. Not the ghost of a rose. Not the lily scissoring water in its milk glass. Not the icy sidewalk, half a world from home, that petals orange and blue as butane, blossom scented with violence. Each spring, the bird of paradise cuts my window. I remember the country I loved without love, a blade of grass greener in revision, so that jungle bisecting the city wasn't the obsidian kingdom I drove by in silence, but a brushstroke in high wind. I once believed the mouth of a tiger, province the lost inhabit. Nothing populates memory. I left a republic for a northern city. I swallowed a river of stone.
The images are so striking. I mean, throughout the book, but in that poem, just where we start and where we end, and the images that are placed in front of us through that sequence. It's really remarkable. So, like you said, this is your second book, and I love hearing how books develop differently, from book one to book two. How about the publishing process? So, how did you go about finding a publisher for the first book, and was it different for book two? tell us a little bit about the background on the publishing.
So, because my first book did come out of that MFA context, at the time I wasn't entirely aware of all the variety of possibilities
Mm,
that exist. And that was also a dozen years ago. So, I think at that time, there was a very common mindset that if you have a first book, then you're going to submit this to a first book contest,
mhm,
which is the route that I took. I sent it to university presses, went around and around, and eventually it did win a contest. So the second time around, which was, almost a decade later, now it seemed like there's so many more avenues
mm,
for publishing. In the beginning, I did submit to certain contests at universities, and it was a semi-finalist, finalist. It kept going around and around. And eventually I decided to just go out on a limb and try an indie press, which is Jackleg Press. And the way they do things is that they ask you to submit just a small handful. It's a query. And if they're interested in that, then they'll ask you to send in a full book. And because the poetry editor there, her name is Simone, had read some of my work previously for a literary journal, I thought, okay, maybe this might be something that could interest her. And fortunately it did. So that's how that worked out. And I ended up withdrawing from other places I was still waiting to hear from. All in all, it took about 14 months from beginning to end. And what's been so wonderful about this is that it's kind of freeing, that there isn't only one route. You don't have to do, the contest route. It doesn't have to be an enormous press. You can find a very dedicated, smaller press and still find everything that you wanted in terms of support or, getting the word out there or how the design turns out. It can still work out entirely fine.
mm.
So
Yeah,
that's how that went.
yeah, wonderful. And I love, you know, having had both experiences, right? You can really vouch for, uh, you know, maybe validity is not quite the right word, but I think people worry, poets who, first time trying to publish a first book, poets worry, oh, if I go with this, with this kind of press, is it a ding on my reputation? Or, if I don't get that contest, I mean, there's so many sort of emotions wrapped up in it. And I think fundamentally, that perspective that you're suggesting, look, the quality, the support, the finished product can most certainly be um, satisfying, no matter the route that we take to that publication. And I would echo that from my experience as well. So I'm curious, you mentioned your writing partner who you exchange work with, and you mentioned you got an MFA. Were there what or who supported you most in producing this book? And did you have help on, for example, the structuring of the book?
I would say my writing partner helped a lot. Her name is Sharon. Just in terms of knowing that she was also going through the same process at the time she was working on her second book. And we both, succeeded at that. So that was invaluable. Even if it's only one other person, just knowing that someone is on your side and is kind of rooting for you in the background, that really helps. In terms of structuring the book, I didn't have help on that because I tend to be very precise in how I think something should unfold. I mean, for good or ill, it's a bit of just my personal habit of wanting to control how that's going to pan out. But sometimes other support is more abstract, far more abstract. It could just be something that you're into at the time, like maybe music or turning to the other arts or reading the work of other poets along the way. So I did a lot of that. So
Is there a subject matter that you went really deep on during this process?
it's funny that you asked that. I really a lot of the book happened during the pandemic. We all had these stretches and oodles of time. And I went down this entire YouTube figure skating rabbit hole, which seems to have nothing to do with the book on its surface. And yet the more I thought about it, it really appealed to me. I mean, it's an incredible amount of work, especially for those skaters who are trying to get to the Olympic level. It's beautiful, it's dazzling. Under the surface, there's all of the sweat that goes into it. And that kind of appealed to me. So I did end up writing a few figure skating related poems specifically for the book. And I was thinking in terms of, if we want to make something very beautiful as the finished product, what kind of effort went into it behind the scenes? So that influenced my thinking also.
Hmm. I love that. And figure skating, I hadn't really, considered. I mean, the possibilities are endless, right? Where we can find that sort of inspiration to do the work and to consider, how that work then appears in the world, right? Like I'm thinking of figure skating and how brief that moment is on the ice for them, right? Like, what's a typical routine? Maybe a minute or two, maybe three, which is very similar to a poem, right? A poem is a short moment for the reader reading it on the page or the audience experiencing it, as you read it. Um, but the impression that we get, right? The impression of that figure skating, the gestures that are made, as you said, like the dazzling aspect of that performance, can really leave a mark, um, in our psyches, as poems do. So I love that as a sort of analogous or parallel uh, form that one could meditate on. Would you like to maybe read another poem that takes inspiration from either the figure skating or some other aspect that you'd like to draw our attention to?
Sure. I'll go ahead and read you one of those figure skating poems after all. So during the Sochi Olympics, Carolina Kostner, who's an Italian skater, was skating to Bolero. To Carolina Kostner on Bolero. Because I live for the comeback, staged in black. Cold expanse waiting to be writ. Because I love the way one arm lifts in time to what Ravel imagined as a masterpiece, with no music, repetition made magic only because each shift intensifies. Piston or hammer in the ear. I love the ice that brings us here. Across the years spent counting spins, an illusionist flight of doves, or Samara in the rain. Because I've walked through gray cities, gray futures. I love the sudden break of evidence of nothing exactly. The surface of things tattooed with light before a cloud elides the hill. I still believe in beauty, a measured movement, a name fogged on a bus pane. Whatever we love is already leaving. Whatever we touch dissolves.
Mm, that gives me the the goosebumps of recognizing that truth and that beauty. Um, what advice do you have for poets who are putting together collections, either a first or a second book, maybe even, later books? What do you wish that you had known earlier about that process?
I would say to not compare
Mm,
because it's very easy when you're really young and you're a student to see that other people have books and to have this ambition of when will I have mine? When will I get there? You need to have a longer sense of time. There's no hurry. There's no arbitrary finish line that you've somehow got to get to, and that will somehow be a marker of success. That doesn't exist. The timeline is going to be different for everyone. So I was talking to another poet not that long ago, and she was in her 40s when her first book came out. And that's perfectly okay. There's no rush out of the gate about any of this. Something else I wish I would have known sooner is that it can be fun. It doesn't have to be so serious, so kind of nose to the grindstone type of approach to things. You can bring a lot of yourself into it, and you can give yourself permission to write the kind of poems you'd like to be reading or that would be interesting to you. Because I think a lot of times, it's very natural for poets to read other poets and then to maybe form some kind of idea about, oh, this is what a poem looks like. This is what my poem should be like, which is not necessarily true. So to go along with that, I try very hard not to make these hard and fast distinctions between, this is high art and it's worth being in a poem, and this is pop culture, maybe it doesn't belong. Why not? You can bring all of it, all of its fuel. So don't make these little inner judgments or have preconceived ideas about, can I put this in a poem? Or maybe I shouldn't. You should absolutely put that in a poem. So you don't know what's going to happen.
Hmm.
And maybe by your doing that, someone else who reads it later might also find that permission as well. Like, oh, someone's gone before me, so it is acceptable, and I can write in this particular.
That's so wise. And that question literally came up when I was teaching a workshop yesterday. The student brought in a poem. It had some content that she just wasn't her norm. And she was asking this question, should I write this poem? Should I put this in a poem? And I really appreciate the answer that you give, or the suggestion that you're giving to all of us to follow that instinct, and to, it's not that we don't pay attention to what's being written right now. I think that is an important part of the practice, but to fundamentally come back to the things that are driving your own curiosity, your own process, your own poem making. That's such a powerful permission. So, is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you would like to say about the book, about the process of developing the book? Um, yeah, anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to say?
No, not that I can think of. I think you've been pretty thorough.
Okay. Well, this has been such a pleasure, and it's such a, honor to be able to have this conversation and delve into the process behind this beautiful work. So again, the book is Fabulosa, and it's from Jackleg Press. I'm assuming folks can get it at the press website. Where else can they find the book, and where can they find you?
So the book is published by Ingram, which means you can find it almost anywhere, at bookshop, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, even at your independent bookseller. So that's easy enough to find. And my website is www.karenrigby.com, which will pretty much tell you everything that you need to know about it.
Great. Well, Karen, thank you again. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. I appreciate it.